American history has never been short on drama. But there was one year, 1876, when the entire nation seemed to teeter on the edge of a second civil war. Picture this. Barely a decade after the blood-soaked conflict of 1861 to 1865, Americans once again found themselves in a frenzy over who would become president. And this wasn't your garden-variety political bickering. No, this was the very real possibility of two men taking the oath of office on the same day. One country, two presidents. Sounds like the trailer for a Hollywood thriller, doesn't it? Only this wasn't fiction. This was the United States in the flesh. And in that moment, many feared that the old wounds of the Civil War, scarcely scarred over, were about to be ripped wide open. And this time, no one was sure if the nation could be stitched back together again. To understand why the election of 1876 was such a powder keg, we need to roll back the clock to 1865, the end of the Civil War. The Union had triumphed. Slavery as an institution was abolished. But victory, as any honest historian will tell you, never comes without wreckage. The South lay devastated, its economy shattered, its society seething with bitterness. The North had won the war, yes, but now it faced the daunting task of Reconstruction, a word that sounded neat and technical on paper, but in practice was anything but. In theory, Reconstruction was noble: reintegrate the southern states, guarantee citizenship and voting rights for freedmen, and build a more unified America. In reality, it felt like a homework assignment handed to a student who already despised the teacher. To Southerners, it was humiliation piled on defeat, Washington sending in federal hall monitors to police their every move. The Southern states were required to ratify the 14th Amendment, which promised citizenship and equal protection under the law to anyone born in the United States. On parchment, it glittered with idealism. In practice, many states immediately passed laws erecting barriers: literacy tests, property requirements, poll taxes. The law was written in ink, but prejudice was carved with a knife. So by the time 1876 rolled around, the backdrop was combustible. The North was weary of Reconstruction. The South was seething under it, and the entire country was disgusted with the rampant corruption of President Ulysses S. Grant's administration. In other words, the perfect recipe for a political disaster. Onto the stage walked two men, Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican governor of Ohio. He was chosen not because he dazzled, but because he didn't carry the stink of scandal like so many others in his party. A safe choice, the embodiment of let's just hold this country together with duct tape. Samuel J. Tilden, Democratic governor of New York. Tilden had made his name fighting corruption, and Southerners adored him for promising to end Reconstruction. He was, in many ways, the face of a return to normalcy, or at least what Democrats imagined normalcy to be. The contest was razor-tight from the start. At first, it looked like Tilden had pulled it off. He won the popular vote, and it seemed the Electoral College as well. Champagne corks popped. Celebrations began. But then came the morning after a classic Netflix-style plot twist. The results shifted. Suddenly, three crucial states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, were up in the air. And with them, the entire presidency. What followed was a circus: intimidation at polling places, blatant fraud, and the kind of absurdity that makes historians both chuckle and wince. In South Carolina, somehow, more votes were counted than there were registered voters. A true democratic miracle, if you believed in the undead casting ballots. And here lies the bitter comedy. These fraudulent ballots weren't just cheap tricks. They revealed the deeper chaos of a democracy still struggling with the very act of counting votes fairly. America was learning, painfully, that democracy is not only about ideals, it's about paperwork. In Louisiana and Florida, violence was everywhere. Ballots weren't standardized. Each party printed its own. The Democrats, ever inventive, came up with a clever trick. They printed ballots designed to look almost identical to the Republican ones, hoping to confuse illiterate voters. And it worked. No one could tell for sure who people were actually voting for. South Carolina went one better, or worse, depending on your sense of humor. The number of ballots cast exceeded the number of eligible voters. A democratic miracle, you might say, unless you believe the dead had suddenly developed a keen interest in politics. Both sides shouted victory, and America, still haunted by the ghost of the Civil War, shivered. People began asking a chilling question. If both men take the oath, who commands the army? And if the soldiers split their loyalties, aren't we staring down the barrel of Civil War, Part 2? The crisis only deepened. Federal troops were ordered to secure Washington, their bayonets gleaming as a silent warning. Rumors spread that Tilden planned his own inauguration in New York. The mere thought of a country with two presidents was enough to make the public break into a cold sweat. Civil War veterans, North and South alike, started rallying. General George McClellan, once the Union's commander, was rumored to be reaching out to former Confederate leaders, preparing for the worst-case scenario. Americans at the time had a word for this looming nightmare: Mexicanization. It meant politics devolving into violence, where the side with more guns decided who ruled. And that, above all, was the terror: to relive the bloody chaos of the 1860s. So how did America solve it? In a very American way, they formed a commission. 15 men, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 supposedly neutral Supreme Court justice to cast the deciding vote. The man chosen was Justice David Davis, renowned for his fairness. But American politics always has a trick up its sleeve. Democrats tried to woo him by offering a Senate seat. Davis, to his credit, felt this compromised his neutrality and stepped aside. His seat was filled by another justice, this time a Republican, and you can imagine how the votes went after that. Along strict party lines, Hayes squeaked by with 185 electoral votes to Tilden's 184, a one-vote margin that left half the country fuming. Hayes soon earned a less than flattering nickname: his fraudulency. The danger was real. Yet somehow the Second Civil War never came. Why not? Historians generally point to 3 reasons. First, the old scars were too deep. Over 600,000 Americans had died in the First Civil War, a collective trauma still raw enough to paralyze the thought of repeating it. Second, Tilden himself was passive. Though many of his supporters were willing to take up arms, he hesitated. He didn't want to spill blood to claim the presidency. Some scholars call it a missed chance, but in truth, his restraint may have spared the country a catastrophe. And third, there was still faith, however strained, in the system. Both parties, for all their rage, still clung to the belief that the United States had to endure as a single nation. It may have sounded hollow, but sometimes it's the hollow slogans that keep a country alive. There's a famous theory that the Republicans and Democrats struck a backroom deal. Hayes would get the presidency in exchange for ending Reconstruction and pulling federal troops out of the South. And in practice, Hayes did exactly that. But here's the catch: there's no hard evidence of a formal agreement. Maybe it wasn't a shady political bargain at all. Maybe Hayes was simply a more moderate Republican, and maybe the country was just bone tired of Reconstruction. Either way, the outcome was the same. The South slipped back into the hands of conservative white elites, while Black Americans were forced into nearly a century of systemic oppression and segregation. A tragic turn, whatever you call it. Looking back, the election of 1876 leaves us with some sobering lessons. Democracy is fragile. A handful of ballots can push a nation to the edge of civil war. Institutions matter. That awkward little commission, imperfect though it was, kept the country from tearing itself apart. History doesn't repeat, but it casts a long shadow. Think of the contested election in 2000 between Bush and Gore, or even the turmoil of 2020. Echoes of 1876 still reverberate. And perhaps the most ironic lesson: America avoided a second civil war not because people suddenly loved each other, but because they were simply too exhausted to fight again. Sometimes, fatigue itself becomes a historical force. The election of 1876 stands as a paradox. Democracy can be chaotic, riddled with fraud, even perilously close to collapse. And yet democracy, through compromise, through the flimsy but persistent belief that the system will hold, is what kept America standing. Some say history is just the repetition of mistakes. But in 1876, America chose not to repeat its greatest mistake, another civil war. That choice, shaky and reluctant as it was, may have been one of the hardest-won victories in the history of American politics. As I often remind my students, history isn't always decided by battles. Sometimes it's decided in those moments when people stop, sigh, and choose not to fight. So let me turn the question to you. If America had truly erupted into a second civil war in 1876, how different do you think our history would look today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy exploring these strange historical crossroads, these moments when the world was one breath away from disaster, make sure to subscribe. Because in the next episode, we'll dive into another, almost moment that was every bit as dramatic as a Hollywood script.